General Healey, thank you for being with us this morning. I do want to talk about the opioid epidemic this morning, and I want to start ask you about your unique vantage point on it. How is it? You've got two teams of law enforcement coming at this from the federal level and at the state level. What tools do you have at the state level that are different from the feds?
Well, thank you, Ross, and many thanks to the Atlantic and to STAT for putting on this summit, an incredibly important topic. We know how devastating the opioid crisis is for families and communities here in Massachusetts and across this country. And I think what I bring in terms of a perspective, I'm an attorney general, I'm a state attorney general, and we're really looking to operate across a number of fronts. And in fact, there are many tools we have within our office that we have used to approach this crisis from many different perspectives and strategies. Fundamentally, I think that is absolutely essential. Let me tell you a little bit about what that looks like. First thing we did when I took office, we noticed that the price of Narcan was going up in a startling way that led to first responders not being able to pay for, not being able to access Narcan. We look out for things like price gouging in my line of work. We struck a deal with the maker of Narcan and secured an arrangement where they made Narcan available at a low cost to all first responders in the state. I have a healthcare division and a consumer protection division, and we set about looking at what prescribers were doing here in Massachusetts and whether there were prescribers who were prescribing illegally or in a way that suggested they may not have been following really guidelines and appropriate practices. We shut down some of those bad prescribing practices. We also worked with pharmacies. Again, within my office, we spend time looking at drug pricing. We spend time looking at the practices of pharmaceutical companies as well as pharmacies. And we secured an agreement with our major pharmacy chains, Walgreens and CVS, that resulted in them changing some of their practices around the dispensing of opioids and training pharmacists on reviewing a prescription monitoring database before dispensing opioids. Obviously, my Medicaid fraud division is focused on access to treatment and whether there are whether there's fraud or deceptive practices when it comes to care and the providing of care. And we ended up taking action against entities purporting to offer treatment, telling families that they could send their loved ones to this sober house or this treatment center, and this is something that you all have covered extensively, but we undertook investigations and have worked to shut down some of those bad actors, because unfortunately in this crisis, we've seen people exploit. Of course, I've got a robust criminal bureau. We have increased the number of resources to take heroin and now fentanyl, which increasingly is accounting for 70% of our drug overdose deaths in the state, working to take those drugs off the street. That is important. And finally, I'd say, as an office, we call ourselves the People's Law Firm. I am big time focused on prevention and education. We can talk more about that, but I've spent a lot of time and resources from my office trying to institute more across-the-board statewide training, particularly for young people, middle school on up on this issue, because the best way to stop addiction, in my view, is to stop it before it sets in.
Wow. You all are also, your office is working with 40 other states' attorney generals' offices, as I understand it. And tell me about that investigation. You're doing a joint investigation into the drug makers, and I've heard that it's like the largest investigation of its kind, joint investigation of its kind. What are the historical precedents for an effort like this?
Well, you mentioned an important component of the work that we do as an office. Oftentimes we do find ourselves working together as states, and we're currently engaged in the largest public health investigation, I think, in American history. There are some analogs to this work, particularly with the work that state AGs did, looking at the practices, marketing and sales practices of tobacco companies, resulting in significant reforms and changes years ago. But we work together on a number of fronts, whether it's combating mortgage fraud or I mentioned the tobacco example. Here is an instance where you see, and I'm proud that Massachusetts is in a leadership role here, 44 state AGs, Republican, Democrat, from rural and urban states, all working together. to investigate the sales and marketing and distribution practices of the branded opioid manufacturers and distributors. It's an extensive and ongoing investigation. It has been for many, many months now. My hope is that we'll get answers to some questions. What, if anything, in their actions contributed to this crisis? We know these drugs are addictive, we know they're dangerous, and we know that they're contributing to significant harm across the board. We need to get an understanding, and the American people need to have answers as to what happened. It's also important from my perspective that the appropriate steps be taken in terms of reform. And certainly that is something that we'd be seeking as part of this process. But ongoing investigation, so I'm somewhat limited in what I can say. Needless to say, we've taken numerous depositions, reviewed hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. And the goal, as the goal is with any investigation by an office like mine, is to get answers, to get to the bottom of what happened, what contributed to this. I want to make sure that going forward especially, not only is there accountability where there needs to be accountability, but also, importantly, that going forward, the right policies, the right measures, the right reforms are in place so that we don't see this happen again. Today, as we sit here, 5 people will die in Massachusetts from this crisis. It doesn't begin to tell the story when you think about the dozens more who will overdose today and be brought back to life through Narcan, or what's happening in our district courts, where grandparents are going in to petition for the care and custody of grandchildren that they now have to raise. So we can't act with enough urgency. You mentioned the federal partnership. I think that at a state level, we've been far more nimble at addressing the needs of people in our community. What I would like to see from the federal government is a lot more focus on funding for treatment for substance use and behavioral health, and to really meaningfully engage in that work. The last thing we need to do is cut off Medicaid funding to states. I know how important that is to the ability of residents here in Massachusetts to achieve that. It's one reason we sued the Trump administration. And it's also the case that we need to shore up a healthcare market and system and not further look to undermine or sabotage it if you're truly interested in people getting care.
You've said previously that the U.S. cannot arrest its way out of this problem. Is that a philosophy that's shared widely in people that are doing what you do? And if not, why not?
Well, I think it is, Ross. I think that there's a recognition that addiction is a disease. It has its ramifications in terms of how it plays out in the criminal justice system and people becoming embroiled in the criminal justice system. But this is a public health issue. Addiction is a disease, and that's where we need to put the resources and the energy. If the approach were simply to arrest or even to arrest those who were distributing illegal drugs, that work is important, but you're never going to get there. You are not going to stem the tide in terms of the number of people becoming addicted and the number of people who will overdose and die. And so while certainly I have a robust effort, coordinated interstate too, because a lot of this is happening within this region, Vermont to New Hampshire to Massachusetts, working very closely with federal and state law enforcement there. To me, I think there is a general recognition. This is about prevention, education. This is about changing practices around prescribing and dispensing. And it's about making sure that there's funding so that people have access to the kind of care they need to deal with very real issues of substance use, behavioral health, that as a general matter, for decades, probably centuries in this country, we've kept that stuff under the rug. And we haven't talked about it, and I think we're paying a price right now as a society.
Let's talk about prevention a little bit. I think President Trump was quoted recently saying something like, "We're going to have the scariest possible commercials, to frighten kids away from opioids," very reminiscent of some of the DARE programming that I grew up with. What do the best prevention practices look like? I mean, would something like DARE actually work?
Well, scary billboards aren't going to do it, I'll tell you that. What will do it, I believe, are some of the things that we've done here in Massachusetts. One of the things I'm really proud of, my office took some of the money that we recovered from these pharmacy chains, and we used it to fund youth opioid prevention grants here in the state. And we put out a call to police departments, community organizations, and schools to say, if you wish to fund youth opioid prevention in your districts, apply to our office and we'll give you money to do that work. We had $700,000 to spend at the time, and within a few weeks I had $4 million worth of requests, which to me speaks to how significant the need is and the recognition that we need to be providing this education. So that then led us to this innovative partnership between my office, the GE Foundation, and Chris Herron. And basically, it's a project we called Project Here. And we were able to, through this project, Ross, send toolkits out to every public middle school in the state that contained lesson plans and curricula, that contained a mobile app that will allow young people to communicate real time with behavioral health specialists and those in the field, and that will link them to a network of recovery coaches. See, if you're going to be real about this and serious about it and have the results, you got to provide the education, the exposure. Part of that is destigmatization, making sure that people feel comfortable having conversations about what's maybe happening in their homes, and then being there with trained professionals in our school, within our community, so that people real time have access to those resources. And so I'm really excited. We've seen already the effect of that. There are schools right now in Massachusetts where, using that toolkit, we have reading teachers, social study teachers, incorporating that into their lesson plans and curricula. We have school nurses who are now engaged in asking appropriate questions in routine screenings. And that will help us better identify young people with questions, young people in need. These are the kinds of things that work. In my view, scary billboards or TV commercials aren't going to do it. Let's expend money on professionals. Let's expend money on prevention education for our young people.
What about medical marijuana, especially as a pain medication? There was a study that was released last week, I believe, that said something to the effect that in the states where medical marijuana was legal, opioid usage had fallen, and I think had fallen precipitously. Do you have a view from a policy perspective as to how that should be handled?
Well, I was recently with the Oregon Attorney General the other day, and we were having a conversation about this. I will tell you, I am watching very closely what has happened in other states. I think that here in Massachusetts, one of the things that I'm mindful of is our need to implement our new laws with respect to marijuana. And of course, medical marijuana was available here in the state a few years ago. So that's one of the responsibilities that I have, is to support that and work with that. But I think that as a general matter, we should be availing ourselves of all options and at least looking at options that will lead to saving lives. I mean, that's what this is about. It's about saving lives. It's about building wellness. It's about increasing health. And we can't get locked into what has been the way without considering other possibilities that might be available to ensure better outcomes for people.
Fentanyl has been in the news a lot because of the extreme overdose risk that it poses, just being even more potent than heroin. Whenever you open a magazine like ours and you see a fentanyl story, you usually will see sort of the words Mexico and China kind of flashed at you. But I wonder, from a law enforcement perspective, are you all getting a sort of more granular sense of what that international supply looks like for fentanyl?
We are, and I think as has been reported, some of the fentanyl and other substances are manufactured now by cartels in China and in Mexico and are coming into this country through a variety of ways. Increasingly, though, in this region, fentanyl is more and more of a problem. And for a while, we sort of moved from prescription pills then to heroin, and now fentanyl is really increasingly, as I say, 70, close to 80% of our toxicology screens that come back when somebody has died from an overdose show traces of fentanyl. And so it's very dangerous. One of the things that from a law enforcement perspective, just a little sliver of it, exposure to that can kill you. So very dangerous for law enforcement. They often will go on scene wearing the equivalent of hazmat clothing because it is so lethal. It's a great risk for first responders, but it's a great risk just for the general public who may inadvertently come in contact with this very dangerous drug. We need to continue the coordination that we have with DEA, with federal authorities, working across state lines as well around interdiction, because we got to do everything we can to disrupt these cartels that are just wreaking havoc within and among our communities, and I'm certainly committed to doing that. But challenging times, and we're seeing things that we haven't seen before, and the nature and the scope of this danger, the lethality of something like fentanyl or carfentanil. We've got to do everything we can to keep up with that. When I started, I didn't realize this when I became Attorney General here in Massachusetts. There was no law that made the trafficking of fentanyl a crime. We had a crime of trafficking for cocaine, for heroin, but we didn't have one for fentanyl. So I proposed a law to make the trafficking of fentanyl a crime. It was signed into law a few years ago, and we've prosecuted over 40 individuals and organizations under that law. I think that's important to have the tools from a law enforcement perspective as well that match the seriousness of what we're facing.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, is it possible we're going to see something even worse than fentanyl? You often hear that a kind of first principle of drug prohibition is that the drugs get smaller and more potent. So should we be bracing for, have we reached sort of peak potency, or is this going to get worse?
I think that while we've seen the numbers decrease here in Massachusetts over the last year, some 8%, that's no consolation to any parent who has lost a child to this disease. I think that we have to be in a space, Ross, where the focus is on prevention and education. And that's why, as Attorney General, I am so focused on youth education and prevention, to educate so that there is this apprehension that the kind of material and substances that are out there that are being manufactured, it's incredibly sophisticated, incredibly dangerous, and people really need to educate themselves and be aware. As Attorney General, where day to day, so much of the work is dealing with problems that have happened, bad things have happened to people. It makes me that much more a proponent of our work on the front end. What can we do prophylactically? What can we do affirmatively so that people don't end up in difficult situations? How can we help young people, provide them the education and the prevention that we need? I'm sorry we don't have a statewide substance use prevention program here in Massachusetts. I hope we have one. We should have one, but in the meantime, I'm going to continue to work for my office to provide that funding and those resources to our young people.
General Healey, this has been great. Thank you for being with us this morning.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.